Well, good morning, everybody. I've had a chance to meet a handful of you in the breakout, but it's good to be here today. You know, as we get started with these buffer rules, one of the first questions many people ask is, really what good are riparian buffers? And so communicating their benefits truly is a crucial first step in being able to promoting, the understanding by not only those that are having to implement these rules, but for those that are going to be affected by these rules. So my goal today is to quickly make sure we're all on the same page about the overall benefits associated with riparian buffers. So, what we're talking about are these riparian areas or areas near water bodies, streamside corridors. They're called floodplains. They've long been recognized as being unique and beneficial to the environment. I mean, anytime you've got a Latin prefix in the name, that means it's been around and recognized for a long time. In this case, the Latin term ripa. And originally, most of the floodplains, before, these areas were developed, most of them were well vegetated, mostly forested. And we talk about these things in the ecological community as being an ecotone. And it's a transitional area from the upland to the aquatic. And in many ways, it acts like a cell membrane in controlling how materials enter the stream. And the materials are there's many types of different materials that are actually moving in and out of these streams. So, in today's vernacular, we call these vegetated streamside areas riparian buffers. And we use this buffer term to designate that we're either strategically protecting them or strategically redesigning them to provide us benefits. And we've been talking about buffers for a long time now. Here we show kind of an idealized schematic of a 3-zone riparian buffer that's usually recommended by agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They're involved in conservation programs. But buffer experts have been working, both national and at NC State, plus state officials, in joining together to try to determine what a realistic buffer width needed to be to minimize the land that actually needed to be put into buffers and still get some sort of benefit. And the result in most watersheds in North Carolina is this minimum 50 feet. And because it's so narrow, we've decided that the minimum width here only allows for maybe 2 zones here, maybe a grass buffer in the most uplands area and more hardwood trees that are near the stream. So there are literally hundreds of articles in scientific journals and extension fact sheets that show that buffers can provide, I think it can be boiled down to 4 functions. The first function is to protect the stream structure itself. So imagine, if you would, the vegetation around the buffer slows surface water that runs down toward the stream, okay? And the roots near the stream, embedded in the stream bank, actually stabilize those banks, particularly in the bends where the velocity can be the highest in these streams. And so when you slow runoff and reinforce the stream banks, you get less erosion, not only in the sloped buffered areas where you're not getting sediment deposited in the stream, but you're also reducing velocity in the stream, stabilizing that, so you have less stream bank erosion there, depositing sediment in the stream. And so the less buffer and stream bank erosion you have, the less sediment loss you have downstream. And sediment is particularly important in North Carolina. It's usually listed as the #1 pollutant responsible for a stream degradation. Buffers enhance the aquatic environment in several ways. A lot of it's tied to trees. The tree canopies that you saw there in the idealized buffer schematic, they provide shade, which provides temperature control to the stream. The lower the stream temperature, the higher that the stream has the ability to hold dissolved oxygen to support the fish and other macroinvertebrates that live there. And the shade tends to control algal blooms when you do have high nitrogen and phosphorus conditions. The leaf litter and the coarse woody debris work together in providing carbon and other organic nutrients that are important for energy in the bottom of the food web, and is important for things like macroinvertebrates, like this dragonfly larva here. And the coarse woody debris provides habitat for these macroinvertebrates and fish and amphibians and whoever wants to live in those streams. Now, here's an example of how shading near the stream impacts stream temperature. If you look at the left part of the graph here, you see water temperature and distance from the spring head. In this area, the area was clear cut. You can see the water temperature quickly rise to about 65 degrees in this mountain stream. And then as you make your way down the stream back to a completely canopied and forested system, you can see that the water temperature is as much as 10 degrees cooler only 3,000 feet away. And so that's pretty important here. Remember, lower temperature, more dissolved oxygen capacity, important in all streams, but particularly in our western streams that have fish like trout that are very sensitive to dissolved oxygen, low dissolved oxygen. So the third thing that buffers do is to reduce sediment and phosphorus from surface runoff. We're going to talk about two types of water here. We're going to talk about surface water and strategies that remove pollutants from there, and groundwater and strategies that we use to remove pollutants from the groundwater. So all of these improvements to water quality in a watershed is what really drives the majority of buffer rules. It's about water quality. So starting with surface here, surface water, we could generally remove and predominantly reduce sediment and sediment-borne phosphorus that is coming in from the upland into the buffer. And so in a 2 or even 3 zone buffer, a strategically placed and well-maintained grass buffer at the upland that could be comprised of fescue, mixed clover, Bermuda grass, switchgrass, whatever, just a well-maintained, complete grass system will slow down the water, increase diffuse flow of the water, making it thinner and spread out. That's a critical component there. And as that water slows down, whatever sediment and sediment-bound phosphorus there can be deposited in that grass area. There it's trapped, it doesn't make its way all the way to the stream, and actually some of the phosphorus that's left behind can be taken up by some of the plants in the grass buffer, or some that makes it down into the forested area. So sediment reduction can be really high. It's generally never 100%. The amount of sediment removal is a function of source. And when I say source, how much sediment is actually in the surface water, the width of the buffer, and the slope of the buffer. Those are kind of intuitive, right? If you've got a steeper slope, you would potentially need a wider grass buffer to slow that water down. And you can see as much as 60 to 90%. In this graph here, you can show, it shows the difference in reduction between a coastal plain grass buffer. You can see 70 to 85% in only 14 feet. And that's because those buffers are flatter. And thus like a 15-foot grass buffer might be effective there. But in the Piedmont, when you have more slope, you need a slightly wider buffer to actually maintain and get upwards of 70, 80% of sediment reduction. But also pointed out here, that additional doubling the width really doesn't do much for the reduction in the coastal plain in the yellow bars there. There's a point of diminishing return really there. So since phosphorus is associated with the sediment, the same concept applies. In this case, about 60% of the phosphorus is removed, you can see in the first 15, and then the removal continues to increase, but at a much slower rate. So that's surface water. So what about groundwater? Well, what we're generally, our strategy to remove nutrients with groundwater is generally centered around nitrate and nitrogen. And so riparian buffers can be effective sinks of nitrate through microbial denitrification and plant uptake. What's generally happening in the upland is that, like in a agricultural setting, fertilizers that are usually applied as ammonium or ammonium nitrate, microorganisms in aerobic soil convert most of that to nitrate. And nitrate's much more mobile, and that's the form of nitrogen that actually makes its way in the groundwater and discharges into those streams. But with buffers in the way, we can actually reduce some of that nitrate before it moves into the streams. And the reason the buffer can be good at this is because you generally have high plant productivity, which benefits actual plant uptake of the nitrate, and you have roots there that help microbial denitrification, because that's where the microbes reside. And then there's other conditions that favor this denitrification: high water table, high soil carbon, and low soil oxygen. And all of those components are important for denitrification, because in the absence of oxygen in many of these areas, where these wetter areas are close to the stream, soil microbes like to use nitrate instead of oxygen for their respiration, and release that nitrate to the atmosphere. So in nitrogen removal, having the water table near the surface is key. Again, if the roots can encounter the nitrate, because the water table is close, they can have direct uptake. If it's close to the surface, you have less soil oxygen, and so microbes start to want to convert that nitrate into oxygen in their respiration. And then those two things combine for significant potential removal of nitrogen. And studies vary, but mostly show about 30 to 90% of nitrate reduction in properly sized buffers. Now, there's a lot of factors that govern this. Again, is there actually a source of nitrate coming into the buffer? What depth of that groundwater is the stream and size that will typically drop the groundwater? And is there enough soil carbon in the buffer? But generally, you get some removal. We've done some studies in North Carolina. Back in the mid-2000s, we studied the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program buffers in the Tarpam Basin. And generally, the way that we did this is we would install dozens of groundwater wells along transects from the field to stream edge and measure nitrate concentrations along with other parameters as the groundwater moved through these buffers. In one example of these studies, we had an agricultural land that groundwater moved in this direction through two different buffers here. And in section 1, the groundwater moved through at 4 milligrams per liter, and down here at 12 milligrams per liter. And so we showed differences in nitrate reduction. Section 1 had 63%, while section 2 had about 89%, but had a lot more nitrate coming into the buffer. And I can tell you that section 2 was also wetter. And so it had more of those conditions that were conducive for more nitrogen removal. So just an example about how you may see differing amounts of nitrate removed in your buffer, but generally so. So in conclusions, if you ever find yourself in an elevator or out in the field with somebody who's kind of a buffer naysayer, you can tell them that the riparian buffers are important because they protect stream structure, enhance the aquatic environment, reduce sediment and phosphorus from surface runoff, and reduce nitrate and nitrogen from groundwater before it discharges to the stream. Now, keep in mind, often buffers will provide most of these important functions at all sites. And research strongly supports the fact that buffers are really a critical component for successful water quality protection strategy in North Carolina. Overall, I think that research shows that most of these buffer functions, particularly for water quality, approach a maximum at about 100 feet. And then start to diminish at different rates as buffers get more narrow. And there's often talk about, hey, maybe 50 foot is even too much buffers for current development areas. But really, if we reduce it, research shows if we reduce it any past 50, we could significantly reduce the effectiveness, particularly of nitrogen removal, because you'd have less treatment area, and sediment removal, particularly in lands with higher slopes. So with that, I know that's a lot to kind of digest. Hopefully it was somewhat of a review for a lot of you, but I'll stop there, and I guess we'll have some time to answer questions a little